Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Illinois Learns to Hunt, Deer Hunting 101. So this is going to be a 101 intro course to deer hunting. We do have our Deer Hunting 102 coming up on Thursday, just a heads up there if you haven't signed up for that. Tonight we're going to go into a lot of regulations in the first half, and then a little bit about some strategy in the second half. And then on Thursday, we skip the regulations, we cover it already, and we go right into some pertinent information and get into some strategy and stuff like that. Just a heads up for now, you do not need your video on, so you can keep your cameras off. You also don't need your mics, so you can stay muted. If you have any questions at all, you can put them in the chat and we'll get back to you. We can either answer them, the presenter will answer them live through the presentation, or we'll answer them in the chat. Make sure your mics are on mute so that way there's no extra background noise, please. And if our audio cuts out, let us know in the chat so that way we can, because we can't hear you guys say that you guys can't hear. So if you can't hear, let us know. Or if our audio cuts out, one of us will get on and fix that. We do have some storms rolling through the central Illinois area where we're located. So if our power goes out, we will send a recording of the webinar, a previously recorded webinar. We'll send that out to you guys in an email tomorrow. So if this all goes blank, we have no more power, we'll send that to you tomorrow in an email. Also expect eventually, we're sending our webinars out, the recordings, to get closed captioning put on them. And then we'll send you a recording of this presentation, as well as the PowerPoint presentation and a survey, which you guys can take, and we appreciate you taking it, and give us any constructive criticism and fill out any of the survey information there that helps our program out. With that, our presenters tonight are Dan. Dan, would you like to say hi?
Hello, hello.
Thank you. And then also we have Adam with us. Adam, you want to say hi?
How's it going, everyone? Thanks for joining us today, and I hope you guys enjoy our presentation.
Fantastic. And then I'm Jason. Welcome tonight. Thanks for joining us. So again, just a brief overview. Just a bit of a background on how hunters are conservationists and how buying a hunting license is helpful for conservation and how those funds are used in America. And then we're going to go over the hunting regulations and then some deer ecology, and using deer ecology to help you understand some hunting tactics. And then we're going to talk about scouting, and we're going to talk about e-scouting, where you use satellite imagery to help you kind of find some good habitat to go focus in on. So to get us started off tonight, Dan is going to talk about how hunters are conservationists.
Thanks, Jason. And yeah, like Jason mentioned, we always like to start off with kind of just a real quick overview of the importance of hunting. Obviously, as society becomes more urbanized and we become more modern in some aspects, it's important to understand how hunters are important both economically, biologically, and socially. So we're first going to start off with a quick just discussion on how hunting benefits conservation economically. And for those who are unfamiliar, there's this act that was passed by the United States Congress in 1937. It's often called the Pittman-Robertson Act, but the full name is the Federal Wildlife Restoration Act. And essentially, this act is an excise tax that's placed on shooting equipment, on ammunition, on firearms, as well as on some archery equipment. And the cool thing is that we as a consumer are not taxed. Obviously, that tax is built into the price somewhere. But the nice thing is when you go out to the sporting goods store and you check out, it's not an additional tax that kind of rings up like sales tax does. So it's essentially the manufacturer's level is being taxed. This is a tax of about 10 to 11%, and that money is then sent to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service then uses a formula to essentially decide how much each state gets of this joint fund, essentially. And that formula is very specific. So it looks at the total size of the state, so in terms of land size, but it also looks at the amount of license sales that were purchased that year. And that's how it kind of develops that model. And so it's really important that not only this funding is being sent to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but it's also important that then we as licensed purchasers are essentially acting as kind of that segue to get the state more money. And then the real nice thing about Pittman Roberts and monies is that it doesn't just get thrown into the general revenue fund for the state. It's got very specific legislation around it that details how it can be used. And essentially, in kind of broad sense and broad terms, it's basically used for the conservation and management of wildlife. So it can be used to purchase new public land. It can be used to manage additional public land, but it also can be used to increase hunting and target shooting opportunities on the ground. And so, as I mentioned previously, is obviously that formula relies heavily on the sale of hunting and of hunting licenses. And if you look at this quick illustration that shows basically the number of hunting licenses sold in Illinois, you can see we've had a pretty systemic decline since about the 1970s. And I find this graph particularly interesting if you kind of compare it to current events that were occurring at that time. So in the mid-1940s, we obviously had the end of World War II. So you had a lot of veterans coming back from serving, and they started to buy hunting licenses. And then essentially you can see we essentially lost them, whether it's due to old age, health issues, or ultimately dying. We essentially did a poor job as a hunting and conservation community at replacing those individuals in the license buying kind of system. And so that's kind of the overall goal of the Learn to Hunt program is obviously, hunting is very important economically, but also biologically. And so we need more hunters on the landscape so that we can manage these species efficiently. And so that's what we hope to do tonight is to give you a real brief synopsis over a lot of the things that it kind of takes to get started deer hunting. And then hopefully as we transition to the Deer 102 class on Thursday, and then a few follow-up deer seminars as we kind of go through September and October, hopefully we can get you in a place that we can get you started and get you out in the field. And one of the big challenges in Illinois, particularly for deer hunting in a lot of areas, is land access. And so it's, again, important to think about the context of the state when you're saying, just land access. And so if you think about Illinois in the early 1800s, obviously we're known as the prairie state, at least we used to be. But if you look at this kind of illustration of present day land cover, you can see the landscape in Illinois has drastically changed. And that's going to change the way that wildlife utilize the landscape. Excuse me. And so you can see in Illinois, we realistically have less than 1% of our original remnant prairies are still remaining in the state. And so that has caused a lot of issues. And that's why it's so important that we as hunters contribute to conservation, is that we can start to establish some of this habitat back on the landscape for future generations. And one thing I hear a lot, often from people who don't participate in hunting is, yeah, well, that's just hunters, essentially raising more birds or more deers for them to shoot. And that couldn't be more far from the truth. In reality, a lot of these habitats that we manage for game species are often utilized by a lot of other species. Obviously, as a quick example, pheasants. Pheasants and quail utilize prairie grasses, and so to restore those populations, we plant pollinators and plant prairie grasses. And obviously, those have wide-ranging effects for pollinators, so your butterflies and bees, as well as a lot of other grassland birds. And so it's not just hunters paying to basically manage game species. They're putting a lot of funding into the management of non-game species as well. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And obviously, it's really important to manage wildlife populations, particularly deer. They have a very high propensity for increasing in population density and becoming an overpopulated species. And that happens in a lot of urban settings. So hunting is an important management tool to reduce these population densities. As we've kind of all seen with coronavirus and obviously population density really affects disease transmission. And so the same can be true said for deer. If you have more deer in a very concentrated area, the likelihood of them transmitting diseases becomes fairly high. And so reducing that population density essentially reduces disease transmission. Obviously, it can also help reduce human-wildlife conflicts like car collisions, but also reducing damage to forests. If you've ever been Let's say some of these forest preserves up near the Chicagoland area that have really high deer density numbers, in a lot of cases don't really have deer hunting. If you walk through a lot of these forests, you'll see essentially a browse line that's about 4.5 to 5 feet off of the ground, where everything beneath it has pretty much been consumed for the most part. And so those are areas where the population density is so high that they're becoming, overbrowsed. And so that has a lot of effects, not only to the deer herd, but also to the forest and all the other species that rely on that forest. Hunters can also be advocates for natural resources conservation. We can promote and support legislation that maintains hunting opportunities and land access. We can support this idea of the non-privatization of wildlife. And that's a really fundamental characteristic of the way that wildlife is managed in North America, is that citizens cannot own wildlife. If you look at some of the other, let's say European models, for instance, in a lot of those cases, the landowner actually owns the wildlife, where in North America, the wildlife is held in a collective public trust. So the landowner doesn't own the wildlife, an individual person doesn't, the state doesn't, it is held collectively in the public trust. So just to kind of wrap up this section, hunting is very important to conservation efforts. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam Wojciechowski, and he's really going to dive into the specifics of regulations and kind of how they relate to deer hunting in Illinois.
Thank you, Dan. So yeah, we're going to move on to the regs now. If you guys have any questions, make sure to drop a message in the chat and we'll get to that as quick as possible. But with that, we're going to start on the regs. So what regs do I need to know? So we're going to be talking about hunting seasons, bag and possession limits, licenses and permits, equipment, clothing, post-harvest procedures, and public versus private land. So first off, we're going to be talking about the Illinois Hunting and Trapping Digest. So if any of you guys have been through like the sporting section at Walmart or Cabela's by the customer service desk, I'm sure you guys have seen these booklets. Basically, they give you all the quick rules and regs that you need to know for hunting season and what the bag limits and licenses are. Kind of the best way to access this would be online. You can download this to your computer or your laptop or smartphone, and that's kind of the best way because you have it always with you. I do like to carry a physical copy with me in my truck as well. That's always a good backup, but if you have it downloaded to your phone, it's always with you, no matter what. So, and that's always nice because you could just do a quick reference check if you guys have any questions out in the field. And yeah, you can have that with you and make sure you have it. But yeah, so that's the link right there if you guys want to download that. Next is the Hunter Education Safety course. So anyone born on or after January 1st, 1980 has to take the Hunter Ed course. There's a few ways you can take the class. Unfortunately, right now, I doubt there's any instructor-led ones. So most of it's going to be online, and then there might be field day courses available as well. But if you are 18 years or older, which everyone should be here, you can take it all strictly online, and you don't have to do any field day course or go to any class in person. So you guys should be good there. And the class is pretty basic. It doesn't it covers a wide variety of safety, goes into all sorts of hunting safety. The reading level is not too hard, but it does take some time. I'm sure if you guys would just dive into it and do it, you can do it in a weekend. But again, it does take a little bit of time. So if you need to do this before hunting season, I would recommend doing it as soon as possible. I believe there's about 10 chapters, and you have to go through the chapters, take quizzes, and then chapter tests at the end. So yeah, not too difficult, but it is time consuming. Next piece of information is going to be the Illinois Firearm Owners Identification Card, or a FOID card, as people call it for short. So regardless of who owns the firearm, Illinois residents who have a firearm or ammunition in their possession must have a valid FOID card. FOID cards are issued by the Illinois State Police, not the IDNR. There is a $10 fee, and they do have a 10-year expiration, and you do not need a FOID card for archery equipment. So that is super important. If you just plan on archery hunting, you don't have to worry about this. But if you do want a shotgun hunt or use firearms for any other sort of hunting, you will need this. Unfortunately, there is a long waiting list for this now due to COVID. So I don't think if you guys would apply at the moment, you would get it before hunting season, but you could still try, or at least put your information in and hope to get it as soon as possible. Dan says about 70 days or more. So yeah, it would take a little bit of time. Okay, so now moving on to statewide hunting seasons. So depending on what counties you guys are from, there is archery in almost every county, or archery hunting in almost every county. But depending if there's firearm seasons, there is a little bit of a breakup there. If you can see the first date, or the first box with the first dates, that is for counties with firearm season. So you have deer season from the October 1st through November 19th. Then there's a 2-day break for firearm season, archery again, another break, and archery again. So, and then if you move down, firearm season, again, that's the break for the counties that do have firearm season, the 20th through the 22nd of November, then the 3rd through the 6th of December, muzzleloader only, 11th through the 13th of December, and then special CWD seasons if your county does have that. And your hours for hunting are going to be half an hour before sunrise to a half an hour before sunset, or after sunset, for all deer seasons. So do keep that in mind. We do have a question here. If you are hunting with a kid, would they need a FOID card? If it is your child and you're with them and it's your firearm, they do not need the FOID card, but you do have to be the parent, and they do have to be under, I believe, 18 years old. Basically, they have to be under an apprentice license or a youth season, something like that, or either one of those. So moving on to lottery permits. So you must apply for certain permits by the specified date to be able to hunt. You can apply as a group for some permits, and you're not guaranteed a permit, but you will likely get one. So if you guys are looking to hunt public land with firearm tags, this lottery would apply to you most of the time. If you're hunting private land and you're just looking for a county tag, you would be able to purchase those over the counter. But you can still put in for the lottery just to ensure that you get one prior, and then they won't run out. So basically, you go on the DNR website, you pick whatever county or site-specific location that you would like, fill out your or I think there's like 2 or 3 options for the firearm deer hunting, and then you would see if you draw one. If you don't draw one, you do get a refund. But the lotteries for this have already closed. But for future reference, I believe over the counter, you guys still have the option. Those go on sale October 20th. Yes. So this is what the permit website looks like, or the lottery website. You would pick whichever season you want. So either resident firearm, so the November 17th through 19th slot, and November 30th through December 3rd, or just the muzzleloader season, which is later, a couple weekends after that. And then you would choose 2 options. So that's a firearm tag. So moving on to deer hunting credentials. You are going to need your base hunting license. You're going to need a habitat stamp and some sort of deer permit. So if you guys are just looking to archery hunt, then you would just need an archery permit, which is, I believe, the 4th section down. So either a single either sex permit is $15 or a single antlerless only is $17.50. You guys can shoot 2 bucks in the state with any method. So either both with archery or one with archery, one during gun season. But you are able to buy unlimited doe tags. So if you guys are just looking to fill the freezer and just want to hunt some does, you would buy the antlerless only there. So yes, you again, just to clarify, you need your base hunting license, a habitat stamp, and some sort of deer permit. So archery or firearm, whatever you choose to hunt. So now we're going to move on to legal methods of take. So depending on the season, you may use the following to hunt deer in Illinois: a shotgun, a muzzleloader, a handgun, and archery equipment. So I'll just kind of go through the photos here briefly. The top right picture is what a modern muzzleloader looks like, an inline muzzleloader. It looks similar to a rifle, but the barrel does break open, and you would load the powder and the projectile down the barrel and put a primer in the back, and that's how a muzzleloader works. Then below that, you have a compound bow. Gentleman sitting in a tree there with a compound bow. The lady next to him has a shotgun. So generally you would use some sort of slug gun with a scope on it during rifle season. And then to her left is what a modern crossbow looks like. So some archery related regulations. Broadheads must have a minimum of 7/8 inch diameter when fully opened. All other bows and arrows, including electronic arrow tracking system utilizing radio telemetry, are illegal. So basically, you can't have any trackers or anything in your arrows to know where the deer is after you shoot it. And then check the digest for any additional regulations. Again, make sure you guys read that before doing any sort of hunting, so you guys know what the rules and regs are. And yes, Dan just put in the chat, lighted nocks are legal to use in this state. So some gun regulations. Shotguns loaded with slugs only. So you can't use any double or buckshot or anything like that. It has to be slugs. No larger than a 10 gauge and no smaller than a 20 gauge. You're able to use a single or double barreled muzzle-loading rifle of at least 45 caliber, shooting a single projectile through a barrel of at least 16 inches in length. And then centerfire revolvers or single shot handguns of 30 caliber or larger with a minimum barrel length of 4 inches. So those are kind of your main gun regulations. But again, if you guys have any more specific regulations about gun hunting, refer to the digest. Also, call your local game warden. Make sure to clarify anything with them. They would know every single rule. So make sure to check with them if you guys have any serious questions. So now moving on to finding an IDNR, or finding site-specific regulations for IDNR sites. So this is what a hunter fact sheet looks like on your right here. Basically, this is a sheet that tells you every rule that you need to know for the specific site you want to hunt. So for example, we're using Kickapoo here. It gives you all the total acres, huntable acres, gives you what is in season and when you can hunt it. And it also will tell you if there's any special check-in or check-out procedures, such as windshield cards or a sign-in, sign-out sheet. So again, every site in Illinois usually has slightly different rules. So finding this sheet and making sure that you are legal for that site is definitely something you want to do, so you're not in the gray. You always want to know you're making sure you're following the rules. So find these sites, and I believe we will have a slide on how to find these sites or these site-specific sheets more easily. So we'll move on. Talk about this again later. Clothing regulations. So blaze orange or blaze pink are legal in Illinois, and you do have to wear them during firearm season. You need at least 400 square inches of solid, not camo, blaze orange or pink, visible at all times. So if you look at the graphic on the right, you have to have blaze orange that's full, just like the jacket on the bottom, and not the camo pattern on top. Archery hunters only need to wear orange if they're archery hunting during muzzleloader or firearm season. So if you're archery hunting with a gun tag, you have to be wearing orange still. You do not need blaze orange for regular deer archery season, turkey season, or small game hunting.
I'm going to jump in and add a quick comment to that, Adam. One thing I want to highlight is that archery hunters need to wear blaze orange, even if they're not firearm hunting. I know this is something I've seen commonly at a lot of DNR sites, that even though that specific site does not allow youth firearm hunters on that specific property, you are still technically in the statewide youth firearm season. So you still will need to wear blaze orange those few weekends. So regardless whether you're firearm hunting or anything, if there's a firearm season occurring anywhere in the state, you will need to wear blaze orange while you're out there.
Yes, thank you. So now moving on to legal game. Legal game is dependent on which permit you have. So antlered deer that have at least one antler that is at least 3 inches long or greater for an antlered permit. And some does do have antlers, but that is very uncommon. And then antlerless deer, so a doe or a buck that has antlers that are less than 3 inches can be also considered a doe. They do that just for the fact that it's very hard to see that in the woods sometimes. And if they're less than 3 inches long, then you can consider that a doe. Some miscellaneous regulations: do not hold a permit or harvest game for other people. Do not hunt areas without proper licenses. Do not bait wildlife, but you can hunt agriculture. You cannot deer drive in the state of Illinois, and the tip line is a line to contact Conservation Police anonymously. It stands for Target Illinois Poachers, and you can, I believe, access that online, and they have a phone number, and it's anonymous. You just kind of leave them a tip, say, hey, I saw this and this in this area, please go check it out, and then they will handle it from there. And I will explain what a deer drive is. Basically, it's you have one hunter waiting, and you have a bunch of hunters walking through the woods trying to push deer towards the one hunter with the tag so he can fill it. That is illegal in Illinois. And yeah, and a huge safety concern there as well, because people can get injured. And yeah, we don't want to see any of that. So please don't do any of those. Some more regulations: do not shoot across a road. No hunting by dwellings 300 yards or closer without permission. It is illegal to carry a loaded weapon outside of hunting hours, and there is no target shooting at IDNR sites unless it is at a designated IDNR range. So moving on to tree stands and blinds. It is okay to leave up tree stands and blinds on private land with permission if it's not your own. IDNR sites may vary by site. So again, this would be something that is listed in those hunter fact sheets. Most sites do require daily removal. So please, take your stands with you and take them down when you are done hunting for the day. If you do leave a tree stand up, you must leave your contact information on the tree stand if it is if it is a site that you're able to leave it up. So you do leave a tag with your name and number, just so that the site supervisor knows, and if a conservation police were to walk by, they know whose stand it is and that it's okay to be there. So moving on to post-harvest procedures, tagging deer and turkey. So you'd put a tag on them. The archery licenses are kind of this plasticky material. So kind of my trick, I always like to, and I believe Dan and Jason do the same thing. They always carry a zip tie with them, just so you can zip tie the tag on it. The gun tags do have like a sticky, they're basically a sticker. So you peel them off and then you can just stick it to itself. And that's how the turkey tags are as well. So if it's a buck, make sure to put the tag on its antlers. If it's a doe, you can kind of just zip tie your tag around the leg. But make sure you do that right when you recover the animal. That should be the first thing you do. So again, that there's no legal issues. And if somebody were to see you, everyone knows you did it legally and you put the tag on the animal. You do have a mandatory reporting, so you can do reporting online or telecheck. And then carcass disposal. If you're on public land, you can leave the guts on public land. You can gut the deer there, but you do have to take everything else with you. If you're on private land, and if it's not your land, but you're hunting private land, you have to discuss with the landowner where they want you to gut it. Don't just leave it where you found the deer if that's not what they want, because guts do smell, especially if you're close to a house or something. They're probably going to want you to take it further away. So just check with them. And now we'll move on to land access with Jason.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, so now we're going to talk about land access, and this is difficult for a lot of people in Illinois, given the amount of private land that is made up of Illinois. About 96% of Illinois is private land. So different types of land access that you can have are the hunting preserves. So that's going to be your outfitters, which there are several of in Illinois. You can look them up. Then I'm going to talk about some public land options, and then of course private land. So in public land, there's the federal forest and federal land, and then there's the state public land, and then county, and then there's the IRAP program, which I'll talk about here in a second. If you're going to try to find the state public land, you go to the IDNR website, and you would be able to select a region from this map. So this is right off their website, and then that will take you to A to Z list of sites within that region. So that might be helpful for someone who knows the name of the site that they're going to go hunt. You can find it pretty quickly that way. But if you're exploring and trying to find a new site, it doesn't give you any of the information without clicking on it to see where exactly it's located at and how big it is and all that stuff. So what we've been telling people to go try to check out is this website, which is free and open to the public. It's called Engineered Pursuit. We got the URL down here. So we'll be sending you guys this PowerPoint so you can use that, but you can just Google Engineered Pursuit Illinois map, and it'll be a couple clicks away from there. But it looks like this, and basically these people took all the public sites in Illinois and put them on a Google map layer for you. And then you can click on these different, but you can click on these different pins, and you can go to what that map would have taken you to. So you can use that to help you find the hunter fact sheet for each of these sites, which is what Adam was talking about previously, where it gives you the refined regulations for each of the sites. So this is a good way, and also you can zoom in and see the satellite view of the site and see what kind of habitat is there. So I can give you a start of to see how big it is and what kind of habitat is there as well. So we've been recommending this. I think it's a really helpful tool. I use it whenever I'm looking for a new site to go check out.
Hey, Jason, you care if I hop in for a quick sec?
Sure, go ahead, Dan.
One thing I want to mention, and it's not public yet, but it is supposed to be launched either sometime this evening or tomorrow. But the Illinois DNR has currently and has been working on redeveloping a brand new hunting website. We can't share the link publicly right now, but I think they're set to announce it either tonight or tomorrow on Facebook. But it's going to have a lot of useful tools that will aid in this entire process that Jason's basically discussing, and that's land access. So there's going to be a lot more updated mapping tools, as well as kind of a hunt planner category that will allow you to kind of filter out different sites and figure out, where you can actually go to hunt various species. So do be on the lookout for that in the next couple of days.
Great. Another resource that you can use is the Public Land Hunting Report. So this is the information that they get off the windshield cards. They put that together and allow you to see how much of each species is taken off of the land. So it will tell you how big the land is and how many huntable acres it has compared to how many total acres it is, how many hunting trips were out there. So you can see the hunting pressure for each of these sites. And then you can break it down into the different species and see how many were taken off. And it also gives you an idea of just a quick look to see where a dove field might be at, because not all the state sites have dove fields that are specific for dove hunting. So kind of breaks down, and other sites too, for pheasant. You can see which ones have pheasant stock and stuff like that. So that's the hunter land report, public land hunting report. Geez, there you go. So again, gives you an idea of where to look at to start your scouting process. Then there's the IRAP program. So the IRAP program is where the IDNR works with private landowners, and they help them develop a management plan to help them with conservation efforts on their land. And sometimes they can even offer them assistance to do these projects. And in return, the private landowner opens their land up for access to the public. And it could be for specific species to hunt. So you can go on their website and find a land near you to see if you're interested in trying to apply for it. It is a lottery process, and they do give better odds to the youth and first-time adult hunters. And how they find out if you're a first-time hunter is if you hunted that species within the past 5 years. So that's becoming, they're developing that every year. I think the acres are even up to 19,000 now after this year. So that's constantly being worked with. So something to look into. Then you have the private land, which again, I said 96% of Illinois is private land. It can be daunting, but you can get access to some of this land. We suggest the old door knocking method to try to build a rapport with the landowner and talk to them and try to get access to their land. The big barricade to get access could be liability, and the DNR does provide this card that you can download from the website, and it's basically a small little contract there where you just fill out the information, and it says that the landowner won't be liable if you get hurt on their land. And also, it's as long as you don't exchange money, they actually, by law, they are not liable if you do get hurt. So once you exchange money to hunt on their property, then they are liable for your safety. So that's something to keep in mind too. But to find landowner information, again, I'll go back real quick. The plat maps, so it's tax data to see who's paying taxes on that land, to see who owns it. So you can pay to get plat maps. You can find some of this information online or in the local courthouse. You can also get some apps, like Onyx Maps has a lot of the plat maps for people to utilize, which you pay a subscription for that to get that data. And then lastly, just make sure you stay on the posted property. If you're not familiar walking around the woods, you see a posted sign that's basically telling you you're trespassing if you go beyond that point. And one posted sign we like to point out is the purple paint law, where here in Illinois, if you see purple paint on a tree, that's as good as saying keep out. So that's as good as saying no hunting. So if you see that, then turn around and head back onto the land property that you should be on. So there's something to keep in mind for first-time hunters. Okay. And muted myself too soon. Dan's going to talk about some hunting lingo.
All right, thanks, Jason. Yeah, so now we're really going to dive into deer ecology. And I take kind of a unique approach in the way I kind of discuss deer ecology. And we're going to do kind of a very seasonal approach. So we're going to slow it down. We'll probably spend the next 30 minutes or here so discussing deer behavior and how we can, as hunters, use that behavior to increase our likelihood of success. But first, I'm just going to go over some basic deer hunting language or terms. I'm sure most people are probably familiar with them, but it's kind of what you'll hear me use throughout this section. So I just want to highlight a few of those. Obviously, a buck is a male deer, a doe is a female, A grunt is kind of a low-pitched vocalization that's primarily made by males during the breeding period. Does and female deer occasionally can grunt, but it's typically a much more nasally grunt and much more high-pitched. A snort is a loud vocalization or kind of an alarm call. And I kind of chuckle at this one because any deer hunter or anybody who's spent kind of a substantial amount of time in the woods, before dawn or even after dusk, you're liable to hear a snort. It's one of those sounds that the first time you hear it, it's blood curdling. It sounds like kind of a child screaming at times, but essentially it's just an alarm call. It's typically because a deer has noticed something in that area, noticed some kind of disturbance or something that seems slightly dangerous. And so they'll alert that call, and it will kind of alert all the other deer in the area that something is up. So typically when you hear that, it's not the best case scenario as a hunter. A button buck is basically a fawn male. So during hunting season, that button buck will be about 6 to 9 months old, and he just has not developed his antlers yet. And as Adam mentioned during the regulation section, you can fill an antlerless deer tag with a button buck. A brow tine is kind of these. If you look at the pictures of the two bucks in the bottom, you'll notice two kind of points that are sticking straight up above the eyes. Those are going to be the brow tine. Then we also have a few different classifications of kind of deer antlers. We have the typical rack, which is here on the left, which looks uniform and kind of like your standard deer. And then you have this non-typical on the right, where a lot of points are kind of coming off at irregular angles and irregular shapes. And those are referred to as non-typical. And so as I mentioned, we're going to kind of take a seasonal approach to how we look at deer ecology, deer behavior, and deer habitat usage. But one thing I really like to point out in the beginning of the section is, and I'm personally guilty of this too, but when I think about the whitetail hunting habitat, a lot of times you're thinking of these real mature forest stands that are kind of open in the understory. And unfortunately, that's not the areas that deer like to spend a substantial amount of time. They like to be in the thicker areas. They really like to use prairie grasses as well as kind of thick shrubby layers. So just kind of keep that in mind, that as we go through this presentation, that deer use a wide variety of habitats. So don't just only solely think about that typical whitetail woods where it's kind of nice, open, big, mature timbers. Think about all the other habitat types that they're going to use. So a quick overview of kind of the seasonal approach. Obviously, we're going to basically follow along kind of deer season. So we're going to start in early October and kind of transition all the way through kind of the mid to end of January. We're going to spend quite a bit of time covering rut, which is the breeding period for white-tailed deer, which typically occurs the second week in November as kind of peak rut in a lot of the Midwest states. And deer are what's known as crepuscular species. So a lot of people have heard of nocturnal, which means active at night. The opposite of that is diurnal, which is active during daylight. And then you have this crepuscular, which essentially means that they're active during the twilight hours. So it's best to think of kind of sun up and sundown. And if you're, a new hunter or you've never hunted before, with deer hunting, we're typically going to be focused on the first, 4 hours of the morning to the last 4 hours of the day. Those are kind of the primary hunting hours for deer. Obviously, you can have success in the middle of the day, and we'll kind of discuss that. There's a few scenarios where that can play in really well, but typically you're going to be hunting early mornings and kind of late evenings into dark. Deer have excellent smell, so that's the main kind of defense mechanism they have against predators, and so that's what we're really trying to fool a lot of times with deer. It's also important to remember that fawns are precocious, and this essentially means that when they're born, they're kind of born at a fairly mature state, and they can kind of survive on their own. And this often leads to them kind of being the leader on trails. So if you're kind of sitting in your tree stand and you happen to see a few deer coming, typically the fawn is going to typically be in the front of that family group, with the more mature deer following behind. Obviously, that's not always the case, but more typically than not, that is the case. And excuse me. Now, the whole reason I really take this seasonal approach to deer behavior is I kind of plan my deer hunting season around that as well. If you think of the majority of Illinois, obviously, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of it's private land and a lot of it's agriculture. And when that agriculture is removed from the landscape, that drastically changes how wildlife move and how they use it, how they feed, where they feed. And so it's important to keep a lot of that in mind. There's a lot of natural landscape level changes that are occurring, between October and January. And it's important to correlate those as hunters to deer behavior. Because I'm going to hunt one way October 1st, and come, late December, you're going to be using a completely different strategy. So now we'll start off kind of early October. Early October is an interesting time period, particularly with public land white-tailed deer hunting. In a lot of cases, deer know when it's deer season. So essentially there's a lot of people walking in the woods, at dark. They're getting bumped out of their beds at night. They're getting disturbed. And they start to sense this pressure. And so during deer season, you'll start to notice a lot of activity shifting nocturnal. The nice thing about early October is essentially they've had that public land kind of as a sanctuary. Obviously, there are still people using it, but it's not using it in the way that deer hunters use it. It's not sneaking through the woods at 4 o'clock in the morning and walking right next to a deer bed. It's just kind of people meandering through the middle of the day. And so these deer start to get not necessarily complacent, but fairly comfortable during the summer months. And early October is a great way to capitalize on a lot of those early movement patterns before deer hunting pressure really starts to influence deer movement. So early October, my main strategy is to focus on feeding areas and high traffic areas between bedding and between feeding. And so bedding locations are areas essentially where deer sleep. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And feeding areas are obviously where they feed. So deer have a lot of options in Illinois. I kind of like to view it as Illinois is almost a literal buffet for white-tailed deer. There's a lot of oak trees, there's a lot of browse, as well as agriculture crops. And so if there's standing agriculture, which is often the case in early October, those deer are going to be utilizing that. It's a great resource for them, and it's a great food source for them. They can actually survive almost the entire day in a standing cornfield. It's got cover, it's got plenty of food, and often cases it has moisture and water. That can either be from standing water, or they can also get a substantial amount of moisture just from the moisture content of that corn. So keep that in mind, that just because the agriculture crops might not be on the particular piece of property that you're hunting, it is still going to likely influence that deer movement. And so that's kind of my first step is early October, is trying to identify where these deer are feeding. And you can do that a few different ways. Obviously, the best way is to just get out on that individual property and start walking around. What I typically do is I'll kind of investigate a new area, start looking into that area and start walking around, and then just try to find where the high concentration of travel routes. So you'll just be walking through the woods and you'll start to notice a lot of trails. Often cases, I'll just hop on one of those deer trails and just kind of follow it and see where it goes. Typically, it's going to go back to bedding or to food. And so that can be a good tool just to kind of get you on the right path. Now, as hunting pressure increases through October, that's when things get a little bit more difficult. Deer are, again, going to be starting to notice that pressure is increasing in the woods. In a lot of cases, you're going to start to see a lot of that activity become a little bit more nocturnal. And so my strategy as we kind of get into mid-October is kind of the same typical strategy here of hunting, that bedding to feeding pattern, except I'm going to get a little bit closer to the bed because on nocturnal feeding patterns, they're typically going through the same travel routes. They're just going to be doing it later in the day. And so if you're in an area where maybe the deer happen to walk by your specific stand on the way to feed, maybe they walk by, let's say, 30 minutes before legal shooting light ends. Well, as you get closer and further in October and they start to shift a little more nocturnal, they may not pass your stand until after legal light. And so I oftentimes, as we kind of progressively move through October, I'll try to get a little closer to the bedding each time just to kind of alleviate that issue. Now, as we get into late October and early November, that's when things really start to drastically change in the whitetail woods. Deer are still being pressured, and they still recognize that pressure, and it still can often lead to a lot of nocturnal movement patterns. Excuse me. But they also are starting to go through some physiological changes at this time. The males are starting to see an increase in testosterone, and it's going to start essentially taking over their head. They're not thinking anymore. They're not using a lot of their defense mechanisms that they've kind of evolved and adapted over the years. They're focused on one thing, and that's breeding as many does as possible. And that's why late October through mid-November can be a real productive time. And it's kind of the highlight for a lot of whitetail hunters, is essentially because those bucks are just focused on one thing, and that's breeding. They're not focused on feeding, they're not focused on drinking, and they're not focused on trying to avoid predators. So oftentimes it's a great opportunity to capitalize on a deer as he or she kind of lets their guard down, so to speak. Now, these physiological changes are kind of easily identified as you'll start to see an uptick in deer sign in the woods. You're going to start to see rubs. And so rubs are basically small saplings that a male deer is going to rub his antlers on and basically rub all the bark off. And he's basically doing that to mark his territory. So he has two scent glands at the bases of his antlers. And as he rubs on that tree, he's depositing that scent. And so you'll start to see these rubs really start to pick up. About October 20th is when you really start to see them, and they'll kind of ramp up through the rest of the deer season. You'll start to see more and more rubs. But rubs can be a very productive way to hunt. A lot of the deer research has shown that a buck is very likely to visit that specific rub within 24 to 48 hours. So remember, it's not just necessarily, a lot of people say, oh, he's just rubbing off his velvet, or he's just kind of strengthening his neck. But what he's really doing is he's using that as a communication tool. And so he wants to actively check that to see if there's other bucks leaving their scent on that spot. And so they're going to be actively checking these rubs. Now, the big challenge with hunting rubs is that same research that showed that they visit it, fairly frequently, has also shown that over 80% of rub visits typically are occurring after shooting hours. So they're kind of occurring in the middle of the night. And so if you do plan on, let's say, hunting an active rub or hunting near an active rub, often cases it's a pretty solid idea to try to hang a trail camera up to try to catch that deer coming to those rubs, just so that you can identify, is he coming in at 2 o'clock in the morning, or is he coming in at 8 o'clock? Because if it's 2 o'clock in the morning, he's not within legal shooting hours, so it's not even kind of worth sitting there and wasting your time. So trail cameras can be a real useful tool just to kind of monitor how these deer are still active on the landscape. You'll also start to see scrapes occurring more often. So a scrape it's essentially another communication tool. And there's a few different classifications of scrapes. So you have what some people will call is a signpost scrape. And you also have people that will call them kind of solo or solitaire scrapes. And what I really like about these kind of community scrapes is they're oftentimes a lot bigger, but they're going to be used by multiple deer. And so it can be a real good opportunity to see multiple deer. But again, in a lot of these cases, the big community scrapes are going to be in kind of open fields, and those are very often visited at night. But if you happen to find a very active scrape, it can be some of the best hunting that you've had. And just a quick story to kind of illustrate this point. We had a colleague who happened to come over from the United Kingdom last year, and he decided he was going to deer hunt while he was here. He hunted probably about 4 days on public land at first, and then he started to see a lot of young bucks in the area. And so he eventually found a scrape, and he went over to that scrape, and he actually took doe estrus and just kind of dribbled some in the scrape. And that kind of mimics what's naturally occurring on the landscape. So a buck is going to make a scrape, he's going to urinate in it, and as he's urinating to kind of mark that scrape, he also, you can kind of see it in this picture on the does, right there at the knee joint, the bucks are going to have a scent gland. And as that urine is kind of running down their legs, it then gets into that scent gland and deposits those hormones and pheromones onto the ground. And now the goal of that is obviously to let other bucks know, hey, this is my territory. But the bigger goal is he's waiting for a female to come along, find that scrape. And if that doe is receptive to breed and she happens to be in heat or in estrus, she will then also urinate in that scrape. And he's going to check it again, just kind of like the rubs, every 24 to 48 hours. They're going to be fairly actively checking it and checking for, to see if a doe in heat basically said she's ready. And then he's going to go and start chasing her. And so my colleague kind of mimicked that. He took some doe estrus, dropped some in the scrape, and then he tied a little piece of cotton onto the end of a string and just tied it to his boot. And again, put some more urine on it and just walked to where he wanted to sit, which was about 150 yards from the scrape. Within 10 or 15 minutes, he had several different bucks who have walked by that scrape and just came on a beeline following that doe and estrus. And so that can be a really good strategy, but all that to say is really just to highlight how they utilize these scrapes. They're communication tools between males to males, but also between males and females. Now, as we get to early November, this is when things basically step up a whole nother level. So I have a few of my favorite days to hunt in kind of Midwest for whitetail. And the first one for me is going to be October 30th through kind of November 1st. Anywhere around Halloween has always been a very successful day. You typically see a lot of deer activity. And during that period, the bucks, their testosterone, like we kind of mentioned, is still increasing. But as we get into early November and mid-November, that's when their testosterone is essentially peaking. And so this is kind of peak rut. And there's countless myths and theories about what kind of triggers rut. And in reality, there's one answer, and it's basically the photo period. So you hear a lot of theories about weather and climate as well as the moon phases, but it really comes down to the photo period. And the photo period is essentially how much light is available on a specific day. And now that doesn't change from year to year. And so peak rut is typically around the same day every single year. And so in the Midwest, that's kind of the second week in November, you really start to see things pick up. So late October, those bucks are just starting to kind of get interested. They're starting to make sign. They're starting to kind of go and look out for does that are in heat. Now, as we get to early November and mid-November, that's when the does are coming in estrus. You're going to have does in heat, and that's when the bucks are going to be focused on one thing, breed. This is when it's very common to see lots of bucks that maybe you've never seen before. There's been a lot of documentations of deer traveling several miles during during kind of peak rut. And again, they're just trying to find that first doe in estrus. And so if the property you're on happens to have kind of the first doe in the area that comes into estrus, you're going to have the hunt of a lifetime, because every buck within, it seems like a couple miles is going to be on that property trying to harass that doe because they want kind of rights to breed her. And so that's a fairly common sign in early November, is a lot of bucks chasing a single doe. Now, one thing you'll see a lot during early November is a lot of younger bucks, and they're going to be up on their feet during kind of daylight hours. They're still new to this whole, let's say, breeding and courtship thing, so that they really haven't figured it all out. And so they're just kind of walking around, meandering. You'll see them, sometimes at noon, just running through the middle of a wide open field. And so it's a really good opportunity to see a lot of deer during daylight hours. And so typically during this time of year, I do a lot of full day sits. And I know it's kind of intimidating. It might sound daunting and exhausting, because it certainly is, but it can be very productive to just go out there and try to sit an entire day, especially if you're hunting public land. And you'll learn this as you start to hunt public land more and more. But me personally, I utilize other hunters a lot. And so that's one thing you'll notice on public land, is a lot of hunters will start to get out of the stand at about 9:30 or 10 o'clock. Now, as people, again, start getting out of their stand and start moving around, that's going to make the deer do the same thing, because oftentimes these people are going to either walk through a deer bed, or deer might hear them or catch wind, but you kind of see almost an uptick in activity kind of between 10 to noon. And kind of the same thing occurs early in the afternoon. As the evening hunters come back into their stands, you kind of get another uptick in deer movement. And again, that's just because other people are up and walking around, and it's kind of moving those deer. And so it can be a real advantageous strategy to try to hunt all day. And if you do hunt all day, this is kind of the time frame to try to do that. I saw we had a question from Julia. Is bedding a consistent place year round? That's a great question. And it really boils down to what individual deer you're talking about. So a buck typically is going to have 6 or 7 different beds around kind of his core home range. And what's really interesting about the way bucks bed is they typically will only use that bed under a very specific wind. And so they're going to have multiple beds that they can use depending on the wind direction, because they rely so much on scent. Where does, they are typically bedded in family groups. So there's typically a group of does all bedding in the same location, where the buck is a lot more solitary. So he's relying on a lot more of his sense of smell, where the does are typically relying on kind of that whole theory of we're better off in numbers, right? So they have, a lot more eyes, a lot more ears, and a lot more noses. And so they're a lot more, I don't want to say forgiving, but a lot less particular about the specific bedding site that they use. Does typically are going to be bedding in the same areas year after year. Obviously, their beds aren't going to be kind of in the exact same spot, but typically it's kind of in the same field or in the same vicinity. And bucks are typically the same way, but again, they're going to have a lot of different beds, and they're going to really dictate their use by the wind direction. So now as we get towards late November, that's when rut really starts to slow down, and that's when it's a good time to, again, pick up on those feeding patterns. And during rut, I'm really focused. I think a lot of people, it's kind of the way that the hunting community and the hunting industry promotes a lot of rut hunting. But I think a lot of people get really too focused on an individual buck. So maybe they see a buck on camera that looks really nice, and they kind of forget about what the whole point of rut is, right? So the whole point of rut for a male deer is to breed does. And so if you want to harvest a buck during rut, you need to find where the does are. And again, it kind of follows that same pattern that you're going to start to pick up, is that bed to feed. Deer are fairly simple animals. They eat, they poop, they pee, they drink, they sleep, and they repeat. And so focusing on where the does are is a great situation, particularly as late November starts to come around. The bucks have lost a lot of weight. There's been a lot of studies that have shown that a vast majority of mature bucks will lose up to about 20% of their body weight during rut. And again, that's because they're running over the countryside chasing females. They're not eating, they're not drinking, they're not sleeping. They're kind of living that college bachelor life. And so it's really important in late November that they start building up those fat reserves before winter. And they know that. And so late November is a real opportunity to pinpoint a feeding buck pattern and to try to set up a plan to target that. Bucks will still be searching for does, but there's not going to be many does in estrus at this point. Most of them have already come out of estrus or have already been bred. The does are going to kind of be on their same pattern, bed to food, and the bucks are going to be doing a lot more feeding. They're going to be active pretty much all night. They're going to be feeding throughout the night and into the morning, and then during kind of midday is when they're going to go back to sleep and try to relax a little bit. Now, as we get to the December and January, you'll hear a lot of people kind of call this the late season, and so that's kind of how we're collectively going to talk about it today. Now, if you do take our Deer Hunting 102 class, we're going to go a lot more in depth into each of these topics. But December and January is, outside of rut, is probably my favorite time to hunt. There's a lot less people in the woods. A lot of deer hunters will focus on October and November. And once kind of rut closes down, in a lot of cases, they stop too. And so it can be be a very productive hunt on public land. It's just there's less people out there. Food is obviously less common on the landscape. It's been eaten, or it's kind of rotten on the ground, or it's been harvested. And so areas that still have an abundant food supply, when you see one deer feeding, you're typically not seeing one this time of year. Typically, you're going to be seeing dozens and dozens of deer all feeding in one location. And that's just because that's where the food's at. And so if you can find these specific areas, it can be a great opportunity to see lots and lots of deer. My best strategy for hunting the late season is try to wait for a snow or rain event that's going to, the snow is obvious because it's really easy to track. Mud and rain is kind of the same way. It's not necessarily as easy as snow is, but recent snow events give you a nice snapshot of kind of what's occurring right now. If you go out in a lot of these woodlands, we've had a few dry weeks before the past 2 days, and it was very hard to see any recent sign. And so you're relying on sign that's in some cases a month or two old, just because it's so dry out there that the deer just aren't leaving tracks. Snow events give you that opportunity to go out the next morning and say, these deer were right here 12 hours ago, and chances are they're going to do the same thing. Another thing to focus on is changing weather patterns. If you have, let's say, 4 or 5 days of really cold weather, and then you have a warm spell that comes in, I would hunt that warm spell. And kind of the same in reverse. If it's real warm for a week and then it cools off, try to hunt that cold front. Those pay off in dividends this time of year, those changing weather patterns. A really important thing to remember during particularly December is there is a second rut. So we had this first rut that was kind of second week in November. About 28 days later, those female deer that were not successfully bred during the first rut, they will come back into estrus, and you will start to see a little bit of chasing occurring. Typically, it's not near what the first rut is in terms of activity, but you typically will see a little uptick in activity kind of the second week in December. And again, that's that second rut coming into effect. And in addition to those kind of adult does that may not have been bred during the first rut, the prior year's fawns, so they're about 7-8 months old at this point, if they have reached a certain essentially maturity level, a lot of it's tied to body size and body development, you will start to see some of those females come into estrus as well. So you will start to see those. Now with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Adam.
Thank you, Dan. So now we'll move into scouting tactics. So we're going to be talking a little bit about boots on the ground scouting as well as e-scouting to find optimal habitat. So kind of your scouting basics right here. We're going to talk about trails, bed sites, tracks, pellets, and hair. So we can start off by talking about the pellets in the top right picture here. You have a little bit of a chart right there showing the difference between the whitetail scat and cottontail scat. So obviously whitetail, it's going to be a lot more in one area, bigger animal, obviously more scat. But it can, I guess, be a little bit mixed up since it is similar shape. So just kind of know the difference between those right there. Moving on to the bottom left, this is kind of what a game trail looks like. This is a pretty worn out one, actually. You can see all the leaves are moved out of the way. It's kind of bare dirt, and you can tell that it's just a highway that the deer and all wildlife really travel. So if you guys see that in the woods, not a bad area to set up near. You know that deer will be walking up and down that trail right there. The middle picture is what a bed looks like. Kind of a matted down area, lots of cover around. You can see like the sticks and all the thick stuff in the back, kind of lower in the front, and it's kind of like an oval area that's matted down. You'll find generally if it's a fresh bed or a bed that has been used recently, you'll find scat and hare in the bed as well. If you just find an area that's matted down like that and looks like a hare and scat, might mean that it's a bed that they use once in a while, or maybe in a different time of the year. So when you guys are actively scouting during the deer season, make sure to try and find the beds that look the freshest or the newest used. And then on the right of that is a picture of deer tracks. Again, just in case anyone needs to know, where they come to a point means that's the way that they're going. So kind of looks like a heart almost. So the bottom of the heart is the way that the deer is heading. So just keep that in mind. And again, you'll see big tracks, small tracks. That just basically shows the weight of the deer or how big it is. Little tracks are obviously younger deer, but you can't really tell the difference between a buck and a doe with its tracks. So some more scouting tactics. If you guys are going to be hunting mainly for bucks, you're going to want to look for kind of two main pieces of sign that they leave. A scrape on the left, which is kind of like another ovalish, it's kind of just a little muddy area that they basically secrete their pheromones into, or they pee down their legs, leave scent and scrape their antlers in it and their hooves, and kind of, you can think of it as a telecommunication station for deer. Basically, that's just where they leave their messages. They communicate with other deer. They are able to kind of mark their own territory and see how close they are getting to the rut, because does will come and pee in these scrapes as well. And before the rut, bucks will be checking those every 24 to 48 hours. So it'd be definitely beneficial to hunt over a scrape after a rain or after a windy day, because they'll be coming to open up these scrapes just after a big weather event like that. Opening them up and making them fresh again so everything knows what's going on in the woods. And then another one is a rub. So that's to the right of that. You can see the buck is making a rub right there. Again, deer have another scent gland right at the base of their antlers. So it's another way to kind of mark their territory. Usually you'll find a rub line. So kind of just a quick glance to the next picture, this animated picture right here to the right. That those trees with the red circles right there, you can imagine that as a rub line. So bucks will make those on the way out and on the way back into their beds. So again, if you think of this dark green area as a food source, and where those bucks are laying down as their beds, they're going to be making or freshening up their rubs on the way out to the food, and then again, probably on the way back to their bed. So if you sit along the rub line, kind of during the pre-rut, that's a good way to try to set up on a buck. Again, you'll be able to figure out if they're doing that during the daylight, if you set up some trail cameras and whatnot. But scouting is very important, because without scouting, you won't know where any of these signs and areas are. So again, transition areas, food to bedding, those are super important to find, because that's where you're going to see most deer activity. Okay, now we're going to talk about wind direction and kind of how to pay attention to the wind and play the wind while you're hunting. So if you're looking at this green guy figure right here, the hunter, if you're hunting the deer to the right of him, your wind would be good. But if you're setting up where he is for the deer to the left, kind of where the fields are, your wind would be bad. So if you pay attention, or if you look at this arrow, it's pointing from, let's say, the southeast. If we're, the top of the screen would be north. The wind is coming from the southeast and blowing to the northwest. So the wind is blowing at those deer. Those deer know that the hunter is there, and in that case will run away or be on high alert at least, and kind of usually will move out of the area though. So wind is super important. Kind of our trick that we like to use is you want to smell the deer don't want to smell you. So you always want that wind coming at your face and blowing away from you. If you think about it that way, it'll be a lot easier to think of areas to set up on and kind of how to enter and access areas if you think about you wanting to smell the deer and the deer don't want to smell you. So just kind of keep that in your mind. So this is a quick little setup here on how to possibly hunt a transition from bedding to food. So you won't want to be set up like this bottom figure right here, right on the bed. A lot of times, if you guys see that there's this Salt Fork Creek or branch of a river running through this property right here, deer will bed on those points because they have the river to their back and they can escape if they want to. And they can see everything in the woods in front of them. So points like that where the river bends is usually a good indication of a potential bedding area. So do scout those if you have those in the area that you can hunt. But again, so if we want to hunt those deer that are bedded there, and we know that they're going to be moving to the food, you want to set up kind of in between that. You don't want to set up right on top of them because you have a high chance of risking the deer smelling you and kind of blowing the deer out of the area and kind of ruining your hunting spot for potentially a few days if you set up too close. So you want to set up kind of in between where the second green guy is on top, between the bedding and the food. So it is that transition area that you think they're going to be walking through is where you're going to want to set up. So again, paying attention to the wind direction here. If you want to set up on the food source, because you see that deer are hitting the food source hard and you know that they're going to be there during the daylight, you can set up, right on the edge of a field, off a trail that you know that they're coming from. And again, wind direction, you want the wind again blowing to you, not to the deer. Movement corridors. So again, you're going to want to hunt deer where you think they're going to be walking through. That's a good place to ambush them. So moving through these pinch points where the woods get super thin. Again, like Dan said, deer are edge species. They're always going to want to be on the edge of cover and kind of where they're going, or food, on the edge of cover and food. So if you set up in these pinch points, like right along the river or right in between the field, you do have a good chance of seeing deer moving through that area. So some scouting tools. You have government and private websites. You have plat books, state atlas, GPS units, trail cameras, and a good amount of dedication can help you achieve harvesting a deer this season. And so this right here is a plat map, or an atlas on the right. Kind of just shows you the counties and all the different lands. A plat book, again, as Jason said before, shows you property ownership. A super good app that you can use for that would be Onyx Maps. It is a subscription-based app, but that way you have all that information on your phone. It also has a GPS, so you can use it without service. So when you're in the woods, you don't get lost, and you know that you're on the right side of the property. So just keep those kinds of things in mind. There's a bunch of different apps out there. That's just one we're most familiar with. So some questions to ask yourself. What is the seasonal behavior and ecology of the species? Where is the food, the cover, and the travel corridors? Where might other people be hunting? What gear will I need to hunt here? And what do I need to do to prepare the site for a good shot? So some remote scouting. Pre and post season scouting can be very beneficial. Again, you can run trail cameras all year long. You're able to access public land all year long, so you can go scout deer whenever you have the time. Anytime you do it, you'll be gaining more information for the next deer season to come. It's always good to write down your notes in a little notebook or something so you can keep track of what you see and kind of gather that information and compile it so you can be more successful. So kind of broad to fine scale here, overview of what we did today. You want to pick your specific hunting area. You want to identify potential habitat, identify the good habitat with some boots on the ground scouting, and then monitor those good spots so you know where you want to hunt during the season. And now I'll pass it off to Dan. We're going to be talking about some satellite imagery here real quick on real spots that we've hunted before. So he will explain his spot right here.
Perfect. Thanks, Adam. And yeah, like Adam mentioned, we always like to kind of wrap up, using some of the ecology and things we discussed and show you how to apply it when you're on the ground. So this is an example of a piece of public land owned and managed by the Illinois DNR. And I'm just going to kind of go show you my thought process of how I decided to scout this area and how I ultimately decided to hunt this area. So if you look, excuse me, the bottom left of the map, you'll see kind of this road. And now that road is the basically the closest parking point. So right in that kind of corner there is the parking lot that you can see Jason marking there for us. And so my first thought whenever I come to a new spot or I decide I'm going to investigate this area or I'm going to hunt this area, the first thing I do every single time is look at how can I access it. And obviously that probably seems fairly obvious, but what it is for me, it's not about how I can access. It's how other people are going to access it. Because like I mentioned a little bit earlier during the ecology section, it sounds kind of crude, but in a lot of ways, I'm hunting people to an extent. So what my strategy is for a lot of public land hunting is trying to find areas that normal people will not hunt and will not go to, or for some reason do not go to. So some things I'm looking for are obviously distance from an access point. So how far is it from a parking lot? But also I'm looking at the topography of the area. And so if you're unfamiliar with topographic maps, so you can see kind of this overlaid map on top of the satellite imagery with some of these brown markings. Those are essentially contour lines, and that is showing the topography of the ground. And so the closer these lines are together, the steeper that incline is going to be. And I know without a doubt that incline is very, very, very steep. And so not a lot of people are willing to go down there. There's a lot of people that'll go down there and scout, but once they get down there, they realize, oh my, it is going to be a chore if I happen to harvest when it's going to be a chore to try to get it out of here. So again, I'm not necessarily a great distance from an access point, but I'm in an area that most people aren't willing to go. And so that's kind of the first thing I look for is obviously how easy is it to get to and are other people using it. And then what I did is this particular site is very commonly used by equestrian horse riders. So there's a lot of horse riders and there's a lot of horse trails through this property. And the majority of the hunters actually utilize these horse trails to kind of get around, which makes it real easy for a hunter. But what it does for me is it allows me to set up trail cameras on these horse trails and monitor when hunters are coming in and out. Obviously I'm still using them for deer, but also they kind of have that added benefit that I can also see when other hunters are either coming into an area or coming out. And one thing I do on public land, trail cameras are legal to use on Illinois public land. I typically take some kind of short ladder with me and I put them up in the tree a little bit higher and angle them down. A lot of people are just going to put them at kind of waist level, but I try to make it a little more difficult for people to steal those cameras. Over the years, I've actually never lost a full camera, but for some reason people keep stealing my memory cards. That does happen. So try to secure them a little bit. And the best way to do that is just to kind of elevate it a little bit. Because again, most hunters, when they're walking around, are staring at the ground. And so they're not going to see them when they're up in the tree. But I found this kind of bottomland area that, again, is difficult to get to. I then monitored with trail cameras. I saw that not many people are coming in and out, but there's a lot of deer activity. And next thing I noticed, if you ever see these fields that are kind of overgrown and it looks like the forest is starting to take over, and succession is starting to fill these areas back with woods. When you find fields like this, chances are there's probably some kind of doe family group utilizing or bedding in that area. So when I see these kind of fields on a map, like you can see right in the smack dab middle of this one, that tells me that's probably a doe bedding area. And I have a little bit of a different stance on bedding areas than a lot of other hunters. I will walk straight through a bedding area and kick all those deer out. Now, I'm not going to do it during deer season, but in the summer, it can be a great opportunity. I think it's something you need to do. Just because you think it's a bedding area, you need to confirm whether it's a bedding area. But more importantly, you can see this is a fairly big field. And so you want to figure out where in that field they're particularly bedding in. And so at this particular field, they were kind of bedding in the northern part of that field. In this big field on the right that you can kind of see is just flat green, that is where they were feeding. And so there were strips of corn planted there. Last year, there was a lot of other pollinator browse that they were feeding on. So that gives you kind of your point A and point B. So your point A is going to be the bedding site, and point B is going to be the feeding location. Then as a hunter, you want to figure out how are they getting from point A to point B. Now in this example, things were really, really easy. As we've mentioned a few times today, deer are fairly lazy. And again, they don't like to basically exert more energy than they need to. So they're not going to go straight up a ridge. Typically, they're going to follow it. And so it kind of funnels them. So essentially, you can see you have this ridge line that basically runs the entirety of that bedding area. And so if those doe are coming out of that bedding area and going to the feeding area, they're going to have to walk basically right through this little funnel, right at kind of the mouth of the river. So Jason is marking the ridge line right there. Deer are, again, not going to want to go straight up that ridge or straight down. They're typically going to follow that contour on kind of the bottom side. And so that sets up a really excellent pinch point or funnel. If you are in that area, any deer that's going to walk within 30 or 40 yards, which is pretty much everything that's out there in that funnel, is going to be within range. And so these are the kind of things I'm looking for is not necessarily, where's the best looking timber stand or all this. I'm really focused on where they're bedding, where are they feeding, and then how can I convince them to either funnel through an area or can I identify an area that they're already funneling through. And so this was just a perfect example to highlight the importance of funneling. We have a question from Jared. Do you need to report scouting trips on public land? You do not need to, no. And Jason, we'll move on to the next one. Perfect. And here's another example of kind of the same scenario. Obviously, there's kind of a lot to look at here on the map, but what I really want to point out is trying to identify where you would think doe bedding areas would be. And so there's kind of two fields in this specific example that have that look that they're starting to become overgrown. The forest is starting to kind of encroach and overtake these areas. But what I want to really highlight is kind of this southern bedding area that's kind of rectangular shaped right across the creek. Again, you can see the main access for this specific property is the road up north. And so you can see there's a fairly steep ridge surrounding that bedding area. And again, that makes it very difficult for many hunters to get to. Particularly if you harvest a deer, you're a half-mile drag. I shot a buck out of this area 2 years ago, and it took about 4 hours to get back to the car. But again, that's just because that's kind of why these areas are so productive, right? Obviously, deer respond to pressure. We kind of brought that up a lot during the ecology section. And so finding these areas on public land that has little to no hunting pressure, oftentimes is kind of the most important thing about deer hunting, at least in my opinion on public land. If you can find those areas where people aren't going, chances are the deer are going to be there. Next one, Jason. I'm going to turn this one over to Adam, and he's going to discuss kind of his thought process on this individual property.
Thanks, Dan. I just kind of wanted to put this one in here because it's kind of a goofy piece of public property, but just kind of wanted to show it so that everyone knows that you can still deer hunt on areas that look like this. There's deer everywhere in the state, so if there's a piece that's near you, make sure to go check it out. You never know what you could find, and you might get lucky and you might find a bunch of deer living there. So yes, as Jason is drawing the boundaries here, it's just 2 squares kind of connected right there at the corners, and in total it's only an 80-acre piece of ground. DNR uses it as mostly an upland game site, so a bunch of pheasants and quail there. But they do allow deer hunting for the first 30 days of the season, so basically all of October, and then they close it down. But just want to go through it quickly. The parking lot is right where Jason's cursor is, and that's the only parking lot for the area. So if you can imagine, access is a little bit tricky. So you kind of just got to play it smart and kind of just, see what happens essentially in an area like this. When we went through it and scouted it, any of those small dark green splotches that you see throughout the fields were really young, pricker bushes, honey locusts is what it was. And they were growing super thick. They were super young, but they had a bunch of, spikes on them. So deer can get in there, but nothing would bother them because it was just so thick to walk into. And we noticed that throughout the whole fields, even out into the prairie areas, that was the same pattern. So we figured out where the deer were bedding in the area. Of course, there's a little bit of a piece of timber in the top corner and a little bit of timber down in the bottom corner where there was some acorns and some food there. But mainly they were just traveling out to the big ag fields all around this area. Kind of the other main travel corridor that we noticed was this long oblong piece of timber that kind of stretches through the middle of the bottom square, which is usually in the summertime flooded. During fall, at least last year, it was super dry in there and there was a lot of deer activity. They would use that kind of waterway flooded area as just a travel corridor to get from the top to the bottom piece. And we spent probably a good few hours there, 4 or 5 hours, just figuring out the whole area. And we found everything we needed to see, and we were able to go back and hunt it. Didn't have any luck, but we saw some deer and it was a good time. But it was just fun to kind of dissect a piece that was just kind of funky like this. It's not a big chunk of ground, but there was definitely deer there. So yeah, just wanted to put that out there just to kind of get your brains thinking of spots that you might have near you that don't look like your typical deer hunting areas. And then this is kind of just a screenshot with points from the area Dan was just talking about previously. This is what Onyx looks like. Essentially, you're able to mark areas. I believe this was Dan's blood trail from his one deer he shot there. He was able to mark the blood everywhere he found it. And there was also a tracker. The blue dotted line was where he walked. So just cool functions on there that you're able to mark all that and, kind of put the notes in right on your phone. I don't know if he has any other comments he wanted to say about that, but essentially that's what this slide is.
Dan had to step out, so,
Okay.
but yeah, this is exactly what it is.
Just like I said again, you can tell up here on the right, he has some stands marked, blind, some other deer sign, a buck bed there maybe, kind of that one point with a buck head right there. He has some bedding areas lined out, and also all the trails that are there on this piece of public ground, hiking trails and stuff. He has all those marked out. That's what all the brown lines are. So that's super nice for a big piece like this to just be able to see where all the access is, where you can, walk easier, get to the stand quicker. It's just nice to have this whole picture kind of painted.
Yeah, I'll second that, Adam. I'm new to Onyx. Just started using it this season, and going into places that don't have trails, and you put that tracker on, and that blue line will follow wherever you go, and it will help you kind of figure out where you've walked at and everything, and helps you not get lost, along with being able to put the different pinpoints there to see what you saw and everything else. So yeah, that's super helpful. Sounds like we're doing an Onyx map commercial, but we're not. But it's a helpful app. All right, with that, that concludes our webinar for now. And again, you can pick back up on this on Thursday. So that's going to be Deer Hunting 102. And if I remember correctly, the topics we talk about are scent control, scent products, either masking your scent or doing attracting scents, when to call, so buck grunts, doe bleats, tracking deer, what you do after you shoot your deer, reading a deer's body language, looking at an arrow and seeing what kind of blood's on your arrow and figuring out where the shot possibly hit the deer at, and other things on top of that. Deer stands, different types of deer stands you can use, and other things like that. So we dive a little bit deeper into other topics with that 102. And if you take both those classes and there's still stuff you want to learn, let us know and we'll put together another webinar. So there's always more to learn. I know we aren't covering everything that you can possibly learn with deer hunting, but we're trying. So help us evolve this program for you guys to help learn as much as you can. And then we're going to do Plant ID. And so that's going to be a fun one. We had a woody Plant ID earlier, a couple months ago, earlier this month actually. And now we're going to do wildflowers, grasses, and herbaceous plants. And specifically looking at how they help you with scouting, kind of seeing what kind of plants are around and what kind of food resources are around for the animals you may be trying to hunt. Then we're going to do deer scouting techniques. That one is more satellite map examples, and things like that. Things like that. And then we're going to do waterfowl ID. And so even if you don't plan on hunting waterfowl and you're just interested in waterfowl identification, that's a great class to take. We're going to go over all different common Illinois duck species you may be seeing moving through the area. If you've ever been to a park and saw a weird duck, didn't know what it was, that will help you identify it. And then we're going to close out the month with Waterfowl Hunting 101. So that's going to be the intro course of waterfowl hunting, which is a blast if you've never been able to try it. And in the meantime, you guys can go to our website, which you did to register for this course. You can also follow us on Facebook. We have updates there for any legislative updates, IDNR updates, like their new website's going to be coming out soon, and we'll have a link to that tool. We also have an Instagram, and we're slowly building our YouTube channel. Right now we have a couple Q&As up where we've interviewed the different state program managers, so the upland game program manager, deer program manager, waterfowl program manager, all of them. So we talked to all those guys, and also a conservation officer as well. So kind of put a face with the names that you may be seeing when you're hearing new regulations come out. You can actually meet those guys through our YouTube channel there and see some frequently asked questions that we ask them. In the meantime, we appreciate you guys coming. If you have any questions, please let us know. Unfortunately, Dan stepped out, but me and Adam are capable as well. So point them, shoot them, all that. And if you have any questions at all, thank you guys for coming. We really appreciate you participating with our course.
Yes, thank you guys for joining us. Hope you guys enjoyed our workshop, and hope to also see you at some upcoming ones too.
Yes, that's another thing. Follow our Facebook page and you'll see when we'll be doing in-person workshops. Probably next year, we're hoping. We are connected with the University of Illinois, and they will dictate when we're able to do that. So we'll probably be taking precautions at that point, but we'll try to do something hopefully next season. We'll get that all planned out. And if you think of any questions, you don't have any right now, you can always email us or Facebook message us. We're always available. We'll get back to you in a timely manner. And we're just a resource for you. So please take advantage of it. Thank you. We'll see you Tuesday. Or if it's not Tuesday, we already started Tuesday. Thursday. Great. All right. Thank you all. And looks like we're not getting any questions. We're getting a lot of thank yous, and we appreciate those. Thank you very much. And you guys have a great evening, and see you guys Thursday, hopefully.